The snow outside Winterfell whispered in its usual hush, blanketing the courtyard like it had every year since Eddard Stark could remember. But that year, it didn't feel like Winterfell. Not to him, not anymore. He stood by the godswood as the red leaves rustled gently above him, watching his own breath rise and vanish into the cold air. It was here, in the silence of the old gods, that Ned Stark questioned the oaths that had chained his soul to a dead man's name. He was born Eddard of House Stark. But the day the raven arrived from King's Landing, soaked in crimson wax and sealed with a dragon's head, he became something else. Aerys's man. No one knew that. Not Brandon, not Benjen, not even Lyanna, who'd always believed in his steady eyes and slow-spoken truths. They thought him honorable, dutiful, the quiet wolf who carried his father's sense of justice. But justice didn't survive in the Red Keep. It had been 2 years since he'd been summoned there by Rhaegar himself, under the pretense of peace negotiations with the North. What he found instead was Aerys, frail and filthy, hunched upon the Iron Throne like a wraith made of bones and wildfire. "Do you love your family, Lord Stark?" Aerys had rasped through yellowed teeth. Ned had nodded, unsure, feeling a weight, beginning to crush his chest. "Then serve me, or they burn." The Mad King's paranoia had turned to prophecy. He saw traitors in every corner of the realm, even in the far cold halls of Winterfell, and in Rhaegar's long absences he whispered only to flames. He believed a northern rebellion would soon rise, and he wanted it dead before it was born. So he asked for a loyal wolf, a Stark too quiet to betray him, too bound by fear to refuse. Ned. That night, in a dim cell beneath the Red Keep, they had shown him the bones of men who'd said no. Lords, sons, whole bloodlines. He didn't scream, he didn't protest, he signed nothing. But when they let him go, he was no longer free. Aerys didn't need Ned to kill, at least not yet. He needed a watcher, a false ally in the North, a man close enough to the rebellion to weaken it before it began, and if necessary, cut off its head from within. So Ned Stark returned to Winterfell with silence stitched across his soul. He told his father nothing. He hugged his brothers and smiled. He sat at their table and listened to Brandon talk of his love for Catelyn and his distrust of Southern politics. He watched Lyanna sneak glances at the songs about Rhaegar, and he said nothing. He never warned them, and that, in the end, was his first betrayal. Now, as ravens scattered from the towers of Winterfell, their black wings stretching against a pale sky, Ned felt the war coming like a storm. Robert Baratheon was already gathering support. Jon Arryn, too. The South was cracking and the North would soon follow. And Ned, he would be at the heart of it. He turned from the godswood and walked back inside, his boots leaving no trace in the soft snow. He had a letter to write, one Rhaegar would read in secret, about movements, names, doubts. He would write of Brandon's rage, of Lyanna's restlessness, of Rickard Stark's questions, all of it. He told himself he was protecting them, that if the Mad King felt informed, he wouldn't need to act. But Ned had seen Aerys's eyes. He wasn't looking for information. He was looking for an excuse, and Ned Stark was giving it to him. The candlelight flickered against the stone walls of Winterfell as Eddard Stark sat at his writing desk, quill trembling in his hand. The words flowed carefully, deliberately, measured concern, not panic, subtle, worry, not treason. He was reporting to a king he did not trust, for a crown he did not love, about people he could no longer protect. My brother grows impatient. Brandon believes Rhaegar's intentions with Lyanna are impure. He speaks openly. Of war. My father does not silence him. He paused, the ink blotting slightly on the parchment. That was enough. Any more and it would read like a threat. Any less and Aerys would grow suspicious. The Mad King didn't want facts. He wanted whispers that confirmed his fears. Ned had learned that early. The truth wouldn't save anyone. It would only stoke the flames faster. He sealed the letter with a plain mark and gave it to Maester Wallace under the excuse of personal correspondence to the Vale. It would never make it to Jon Arryn. It would go south, straight to the man who wore the Iron Throne like a crown of knives. Weeks passed, then the fire came. It started with a raven at dawn. Then silence. Ned was in the yard training with Benjen when the second raven arrived. This one clutched by a rider whose face had gone pale from holding the message too long. Ned read it and said nothing, but he handed it to his father with a shaking hand. Rickard Stark's face twisted as he read it. The Crown has summoned Brandon Stark to King's Landing for threatening the prince. Brandon didn't hesitate. That was his way. Passion, not patience. He gathered men and rode south the next morning. Ned stood at the gate as they left, heart cracking beneath a layer of ice he couldn't show. Benjen had asked, "Why summon Brandon now?" Ned had replied quietly, "Perhaps they mean to talk." But even then he knew. They didn't want to talk. They wanted to burn. He watched the silhouettes disappear into the snow-covered trees, and for a second he wanted to scream after them, to shout the truth, that it was all a set-up, that the king didn't want peace, that Brandon was walking into a pit and there would be no one to pull him out. But he couldn't, because if he did, they'd all burn. Aerys had promised it himself in the final meeting. "If one Stark disobeys me, I will light up the north, brighter than the sun." And Ned believed him. So he stayed quiet. Again. A month later, Brandon was dead, strangled by his own will, trying to save their father. Rickard Stark had been roasted alive in his armor, the Mad King watching with glee, screaming for more fire like a child at a festival. Ned fell to his knees when the news came. Not from grief, from guilt. He had handed them over, fed them like lambs to the slaughter. He cried alone that night. No one saw. He let the walls hear what his family never would. The sobs tore from him like a wounded beast. The godswood had no answers. The wind offered no forgiveness. Benjen stopped speaking for days. Lyanna locked herself in her chambers. And Ned went cold. That was when he made his decision. If he could not stop the storm, he would redirect it. He would steer the rebellion not to victory, but to containment. He would guide it like a knife held backward, a tool, not a weapon. Enough to bleed the realm, but never enough to dethrone the fire. So when Robert Baratheon began to call banners, Ned didn't resist. He offered his sword, his house, his name. He would march south for vengeance, with rage in his eyes. But in his heart, he still belonged to the man who had murdered his father. The banners flew high above Winterfell, snapping in the bitter northern wind. Wolves, mermen, and flayed men alike gathered in the courtyard as lords and sons prepared to answer Robert Baratheon's call to rebellion. Men sang of vengeance and justice, of the righteous fury of the north. But Eddard Stark said nothing. He watched them all. Rose Bolton's calculating eyes, Howland Reed's quiet loyalty, and even old Lord Manderly's pompous boasts, knowing none of them understood the full scale of the game being played. They thought they were marching to avenge Brandon and Rickard. They thought they were storming into history as heroes. Only Ned knew they were already walking through a script written in King's Landing, and he was holding the ink. Lyanna hugged him tighter than ever before the march. Her voice was low, scared, a whisper against his chest. "Promise me," she said. "Promise me this war won't take you too." He lied. "I promise." He couldn't tell her that the war had already taken him years ago, in a dungeon under the Red Keep, where he gave up his freedom in exchange for her life. He couldn't say that she was the reason he kept obeying the Mad King, that if she died, none of it would matter anymore. Ned left Benjen behind at Winterfell. Too young, he told himself, too reckless. But really it was guilt. He couldn't bear to drag another brother into a fire he helped light. As they marched south, Ned played the part of loyal friend to Robert Baratheon. They shared bread, fire, and grief. Robert wept openly for Lyanna, swearing he would tear Rhaegar limb from limb. Ned nodded, even as his mind wandered. He couldn't shake the memory of Rhaegar's last words to him, whispered the day he left King's Landing. "There are truths even kings must hide. If the world finds out what I've done, they'll never forgive me. Protect her, Ned, even if you must lie to every man you love." Rhaegar had loved Lyanna. That much Ned had seen with his own eyes, not in cruelty, not in obsession, but in something deeper, a desperate kind of belief that they were meant to bring change to the world. It was foolish, naive, and it had signed his death warrant. But if Aerys ever discovered the truth, that Lyanna had gone willingly, that there was no kidnapping, no dishonor, he would burn the realm to ash. So Ned fed Robert the lie. She was taken. He let his friend believe in the monster he needed, because monsters made better targets than kings. At the Battle of Ashford, the rebels first tasted real victory. Robert crushed the royal forces, hammer breaking steel, blood flying in waves. The lords cheered. The river ran red. Ned stood beside the corpses, sword in hand, blood on his cloak. But he felt no triumph, only dread. The Mad King would hear of this, and he would not respond with diplomacy. He would respond with fire. So Ned sent another letter, coded, careful. "Robert strikes hard. His rage is righteous. But I temper him. I advise caution. I remain your eyes." He sealed it with a wax stamp bearing no crest and passed it to a messenger. Posing as a merchant boy, it would go to the Crownlands under cover of fog and ash. He told himself he was preventing escalation, but he knew better. He was still obeying. When they reached the Trident, Rhaegar awaited them. This time there were no letters, no lies, only fate. Ned watched as Robert and Rhaegar charged each other, two storms colliding, thunder on horseback. When Rhaegar fell, the rubies from his armor scattered across the water like drops of lost blood. Ned stood at the river's edge as Robert howled in victory, but he couldn't move. He had watched the last man who could save Lyanna fall to a war built on his silence. A man who had trusted him, a man who had asked for protection and received betrayal instead. He looked down at the red river. It looked like Winterfell's snow, stained with guilt. The Tower of Joy rose from the dust, like a secret refusing to stay buried. It stood quiet in the Dornish mountains, its white stones glistening under the early sun. The war was all but over. Robert sat on the Iron Throne. Tywin Lannister had painted King's Landing red with his betrayal, and the Targaryens were shattered. Viserys exiled, Elia and her children butchered, Rhaegar dead. But Ned Stark still had one task left. He rode. With 6 loyal men, Howland Reed, Will, Martin, Ethan, Sir Mark Ryswell and Theo Wool, each of them convinced they were coming to finish off the last remnants of Targaryen resistance. In truth, only Ned knew what they'd truly find, and who. 3. Kingsguard waited outside the tower. Sir Arthur Dane, Sir Oswell Whent, Sir Gerald Hightower, sworn swords of a dead king, guarding a tower that should have been empty, but it wasn't. "She is here," Arthur said, his voice like steel, "and she is safe." Ned didn't speak. His throat clenched. He looked into Dane's eyes, and for a moment the illusion of righteousness cracked again. Why were the greatest knights of the realm standing vigil at a place supposedly unimportant? Because the girl they were guarding was not a prisoner. She was the future. The fighting was brief, but brutal. Men fell like leaves caught in wind. And, when it was over, only Ned and Howland stood. He dragged his battered body through the tower's threshold, hand pressed against his ribs, soaked in blood that wasn't all his. The stairs wound tight, as if squeezing him toward judgment. And at the top, in a bed of blood and sweat, was Lyanna. She was dying, her face was pale, her lips cracked. She clutched the newborn to her chest as though it were the only real thing left in the world. "Ned," she breathed, and the sound tore through him like wildfire. "You came." He knelt beside her, tears already rising in his eyes. "I'm here, Leia. I'm here. You have to promise me," she whispered. "Promise me, Ned. Protect him. Don't tell Robert. He'll kill him if he knows." Ned looked down at the baby. A boy. His eyes dark like Rhaegar's, his hair already curling, innocent, unwanted, marked for death, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, the last of his line. Aerys was dead, but the hatred still lived. Robert would see the child as a threat, not a life. He would strike it down without hesitation. And now Ned's silence, the very tool of his betrayal, had one last chance to become something else, redemption. So he did what he had always done. He lied. He took the child in his arms and told Lyanna what she needed to hear. "I promise." She smiled barely, and then she was gone. They buried her beneath the tower. No songs, no flames, just rock and earth. Ned carried the child back north alone. He named him Jon. And from that moment, he lived in two worlds. To Robert, he was the most loyal brother-in-arms. To the north, he was the stoic warden, and to this child, he was a father sworn to silence. But the truth haunted every step. He had betrayed his own blood to serve a madman, played both sides of a war that slaughtered friends and foes alike, led to his best friend, crowned a usurper king, and buried the only woman who had seen through all his masks. And for what? To preserve a realm that didn't deserve it, to uphold a peace written in fire and soaked in blood. He sat at the Godswood in Winterfell years later, watching Jon play with Robb and Theon, and whispered to himself a truth he never dared write. "I didn't win Robert's war. I buried it." Years passed, but time did not erase the weight of lies. It only buried them deeper until they began to rot from the inside. Ned Stark aged not like a soldier or a king, but like a man carrying too many graves inside him. He watched Robb grow, with Catelyn's fire, and Jon with a quiet strength that wasn't his, yet felt too close to something he couldn't say. He raised them as brothers, but never as equals. Not truly, and that hurt Jon the most. The boy would ask, "Who was my mother?" Ned would look away. Sometimes he wanted to say it, to blurt it out in the dark, when Jon cried alone or looked at him like a stranger. But every time the words rose, he remembered Aerys's laughter, the smell of burning flesh, and Robert's voice laced with hate any time the name Targaryen escaped his lips. So he said nothing. Jon was his second silence, and like the first, it would cost him. In the south, things had changed. Whispers from King's Landing flew to Winterfell on raven wings. Robert had grown cruel and fat, a king in name only. The Lannisters were circling, and Varys was feeding, secrets to every mouth that would listen. Ned ignored them all until the letter came from Jon Arryn's widow. "He was murdered. They want the boy." Not Jon Snow, another boy, Bran. It was Catelyn who told him the truth first, how she caught a Lannister in the tower, how Bran fell, how he was never meant to survive. And Ned felt it again, that sickening curl in his gut. The old game never ended. It only changed names. Kings were still mad, thrones still poisoned. And children were always the first to bleed. So when the king came north, Ned already knew what he would do. He would go south again, because he had no choice. He had started this war in silence. Maybe he could end it with truth. King Robert Baratheon arrived fat, loud, and drunk on nostalgia. He laughed with Ned like nothing had changed, as if their rebellion hadn't left 1,000 graves between them. But when Robert asked him to be Hand of the King, Ned did not refuse. He thought of Jon Arryn, dead. He thought of the child Lyanna had died for, hidden, and he thought of the realm, rotting, waiting for its next fire. "I will go," he said, "for honor. But he didn't say whose honor. It wasn't his anymore. In King's Landing, truth was a disease. Every corridor was lined with spies. Littlefinger smirked too easily. Varys whispered too kindly. And Cersei had the eyes of a woman who had killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Ned began to dig. He followed the trail Jon Arryn had left, a breadcrumb path toward a royal lie. The truth of Joffrey, the incest, the throne built on false heirs. But for all his silence, Ned had forgotten one thing. In the South, truth had no friends. He tried to do it right, to warn Cersei, to spare the children, to give Robert one final moment of clarity before it all collapsed. And then Robert died. Suddenly, the realm was a chessboard again, and Ned was no longer the one moving pieces. He was the piece. The guards came in the night. He didn't fight. When the sword touched his neck and the dungeon swallowed him whole, Ned knew this was how it was always meant to end. He had betrayed a kingdom to save a child. Now he would be executed by that same kingdom to protect another. Joffrey wanted his head, but Varys came to him in the dark, cloak whispering like ghosts. If you confess, they'll spare your daughter. The North will survive. And Ned, he'd learned the price of silence. Now he would learn the price of words. The crowd roared as if they had gathered for a festival, not an execution. Children sat on shoulders, nobles leaned from stone balconies, faces cloaked in boredom or sadistic glee. And in the center of it all, beneath the blistering sun, stood Eddard Stark. Once Warden of the North, now a traitor to the crown, or so they were told. He looked thinner than he had in years, hollowed, as if the lies he carried had finally eaten through his bones. His wrists were shackled, his dignity stripped, and yet there was something still untouched. His eyes, they didn't plead, they didn't rage, they simply watched. Sansa was somewhere in the crowd, forced to watch. He'd seen her the night before, shaking, broken, begging for mercy. And Ned, despite everything, had lied once more. I will be fine. That was his final gift to her. He had spent his life guarding the realm from truths it wasn't ready to face, protecting children who didn't know what he'd buried for their sake, carrying the weight of other men's sins on his shoulders, and now his neck would pay for it. When he was led to the steps, the High Septon asked if he had any last words. Ned hesitated. The crowd held its breath. He looked up at the boy on the throne, Joffrey, a king in name, a monster in blood, and then at Cersei, standing behind him like a shadow in gold. She thought he would kneel. She thought the lie would end here, but Ned Stark had lied enough. He cleared his throat, voice steady, cold. I am Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, he said, his voice cutting through the square, and I kept secrets to protect you all, not to destroy the crown, but to save it from itself. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I lied to save a boy who did not ask to be born. I served a king I knew was mad. I followed a brother to war, knowing we were marching into ruin. And I protected a realm that would rather kill me than face the truth. He turned his eyes toward the Red Keep. I have done more for the Seven Kingdoms in silence than all your kings have done in war. Gasps. Even Cersei paled, but Joffrey stood, red-faced, gripping the armrest of his chair with white knuckles. Enough! He dies! The gold cloaks grabbed Ned's shoulders. Sansa screamed, and as the sword rose behind him, Ned closed his eyes, not out of fear, but of peace, because for the first time in years he had told the truth. He saw Lyanna's face, in the dark behind his eyelids, her voice whispering, "Promise me." And he felt no shame now. Only sorrow. The sword fell. The realm would remember him as a traitor, but the truth, buried in a tower, written in fire, sealed behind a bastard's name, would not die with him. Jon Snow would live. And one day when the North remembered, when dragons flew again and thrones cracked under the weight of their own rot, they would know that Robert's war was never won. It was lost the day Eddard Stark was ordered to kneel and obeyed.